afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast State of the Balance with me, your host, Imperial Dane. And we're off here to the January State of the Balance, the first of this year, the year of our Lord 2015. So, what's really changed since December? Well, basically not a lot. We didn't really see any huge patches or anything. There's not really in that sense been any sort of changes to balance. So in that regard, it's more or less the same. It's overall metagame though, where there's been some slight changes, mostly a bit in the Wehrmacht, half tracks the 251 is seeing a bit more usage. There's some tactics forming around that. Ostrom are seeing a slight return as well in terms of doctrines for the Americans. The EC8 and the Rifle Company, which actually for some time had not seen some heavy usage days, also on the return. The mortar half-track though is still pretty terrible, and the American light anti-tank mines are rather questionable in use as well. Those can definitely, I think, do with some work there as well. But overall, the Americans are pretty strong. Same with the Soviets. I mean, their non-doctrinal units work pretty well. Their doctrinal units work reasonably well. I mean, versus the Wehrmacht. And again, it's the Wehrmacht sort of, in essence, suffering right now. Saw some tournament results that rather put the Wehrmacht win rates at the lowest compared to the others, which are actually reasonably equal. One discrepancy of one round actually having heavy win rates for the Soviets. But beyond that, it was rather the Wehrmacht getting the short end of the stick in that regard. Still point to the early game. MG42s, Panzer Grenadiers in need of some work there. And I also think the 221, 222, maybe the 251 half-tech could also do with some light buffs there to sort of make the early game of the Wehrmacht a bit more resilient, which is a bit the problem. So there you go. I mean, the Oberkommando still remains the same, well, mess, where it's usually just down to spamming Volksgrenadiers, Obersoldaten, blobbing them up, throwing it at the enemy, and going for Panthers. Or maybe a King Tiger if you're feeling confident, or a Jagdpanzer IV if you're feeling crazy or not very confident. Now, of course, a Jagdpanzer IV still remains utterly bloody useless for most of the goddamn time. Doctrinally, again, for the Oberkommando, it's most of the time fortification. Elite armor basically sees no usage at all. Again, it simply doesn't work with the army either. So, I mean, there's still a lot of problems there, and the Oberkommando is still in most dire need of an overhaul. For the Soviets, there's not really much there to change. Again, their metagame has largely remained the same. Some go for some, non-doctrinal equipment, but most of the time it's just, spam conscripts, add some support weapons, wait for call-ins, and that's it really. Some players mix in T-34s. The more interesting players do go for something a bit extra beyond that, again, for the most part, they don't really need it. Again, versus the Wehrmacht, they can easily pen it in and take it from there. Versus the Oberkommando, it's a bit harder, but again, it's usually how the resources work, By the time they'll have a Panther, you might have two T-35s out, and in that regard, you're not half bad off then already. So there are some problems there, I would say. Again, on the Axis side. For the Soviets, again, a part of me, some might say, again, it's the call-ins that are more cost-effective. Probably are, but I don't think it's because the non-doctrinals aren't cost-effective either. It's just easier because, again, the thing is, at least from my perspective, is the time between, where you could sort of get them there, and then the time for the doctrinal call-ins usually, it's too short, and there's not really, again, from the Wehrmacht, not much that can threaten you there. I mean, that's basically the problem. The Wehrmacht, for example, at the moment, can't seriously threaten. The Oberkommando really can't seriously threaten either. I mean, if there's a threat, there might be more of a response, but currently, there isn't really. And again, the question is then, why should you go for the T-34-76 when you can thus easily go for the T-30-45 group that's much more harder pound down your opponent, or, an IS-2 and ISU-152. I mean, that's why I'm concerned how things really roll out, but there you go. So again, basically from December to January, not a lot has changed. I mean, it's a bit sad, but that's the case. There's been some slight, again, changes to the meta game, but beyond that, it's not a frightful lot. We're seeing some players, of course, experimenting more, probably all because out of sheer boredom and apathy. But again, not so much beyond that. And again, it's probably from the Wehrmacht, we're probably seeing the most to sort of try and shake up things, to sort of see at least there's something to sort of and make the early game at least a bit different, throw off the opponent, give them time to get something else out. Of course, there's also a bunch of players who are basically just relying on mechanizers, sorting the Stoogie to sort of see the way through, because again, that's currently, you know, the closest the Wehrmacht have to the lazy game at the moment, where they don't have to worry about so much, because the Stoogie, simply put, overperforms by quite a margin. Well, that's probably one of the few units that currently do for the Wehrmacht, if not the only one. So that's rather how I perceive things at the moment. Again, not a lot of huge changes, some slight metagaming. Again, largely the Wehrmacht that's seeing a bit of shaking up. But again, for the Oberkommandowist, it's utterly stale. For the Soviets, small bits happening, but nothing huge. For the US, we've seen a bit more return to Rifle Company. I'm also seeing a few more Scots, which have seen a slight, detour, but beyond that, again, not a frightful lot. There are more players experimenting with the rear echelons. There was a slight resurgence in BARs, but that sort of seemed to have slightly faded away for a bit in favour of the flamethrowers. Now a lot of them are going for Rifle Companies. There's a bit there. Airborne has fallen a bit into the background lately, so has Recon Support, which was otherwise popular for a time. It's mostly now, well, Rifle Company and Armour for the call-in tanks and such. So I think that rather constitutes January's state of the balance, really. And hopefully, of course, that will help people get sort of an idea of things, you know, assess their own opinions and whatnot. Of course, you know, I don't know, make up their minds, who knows. Again, it's just merely my opinion, which so many people always ask for on these matters. And of course, a way for me to sort of impart things, of course, you know, to sort of keep in mind, you know, what have you a chance of playing against, because that's what the metagame is about. The metagame is essentially, you know, the perception of the game, how people think it works, what's best, and of course what people think is best is what you're going to up against, of course, have to deal with. So with the metagame explained in that regard, you know, you usually got a chance of sort of setting things up, sort of counter it and try out some maybe some different things towards stealing it, because usually one of the best ways of fighting the metagame is going completely off the charts against, in which case can usually confuse your opponent, leave him a bit off guard. Anyways, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I hope it helped your game at least a bit. So if it did, you know, feel free to follow, subscribe, and so on, and follow me on Facebook and Twitter. There's a link there in the channel description. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and see you another time. Of course, for another State of the Balance. That will be in February. It's probably the same date, the 20th. So see you all, and bye.